Hi there. Welcome to today's lecture on the 1936 film My Man Godfrey. And My Man Godfrey is considered one of the classics of the screwball comedy film genre. Screwball comedies are really a product of the 1930s. They're a product of the sound era. It's a subgenre that really doesn't emerge until the advent of sound. And actually, you get a few screwball comedies in sort of the early 30s during the pre-code era, but it really doesn't emerge as a genre until the mid 1930s after the production code in Hollywood is enforced. And we can talk about in a little bit why that's so. So, as I mentioned, screwball comedy is a subgenre of comedy that it's very popular in the 1930s and early 1940s, although its style still influences comedy up to even the present day. So, maybe one thing we can talk about in discussion is how some of these conventions of this genre influence some comedies that you're familiar with in the 21st century. So, what exactly defines a screwball comedy? Well, let's take a step back. What does the word screwball mean? In baseball, screwball is actually a particular type of pitch, a really hard pitch to throw. And this type of pitch follows a downward trajectory and has a slight rotation that makes it really difficult to predict where it's going to go. Kind of like the plot line in screwball comedies. It's really hard to throw a screwball in baseball, and it's even harder to hit it with a bat. So the word screwball in general means craziness, ridiculousness, erratic behavior. So screwball comedies are zany and light-hearted romantic comedies with a layer of sophistication. There's often farcical themes and slapstick moments. So there can be sort of these slapstick aspects of it, but it's mixed with a lot of wit and comedic banter. So it's a comedic subgenre that's both sort of like physicality in terms of slapstick, but it's also about the power and importance of language. And there's a lot of verbal sparring that often goes on between the characters in screwball comedies. Typically, especially in the 30s and early 40s, screwball comedies are kind of a battle of the sexes romantic comedy, often fits into a very heteronormative coupling framework. Screwball comedies, especially in the 30s, are often about class differences. So a typical plot line has a rich woman and a poor man who have madcap adventures together and fall in love in the process, usually despite themselves. There's frequently escapist scenes, so sort of images of lavish spaces and dress, often sort of presented in contrast to the other scenes in the film. And most importantly, there's rapid fire, fast paced, overlap, characters speaking in an overlapping way, dialogue, which is very witty and very funny. Screwball comedies in the 30s and early 40s were known for their strong female leads, or at least at the time, which would have been strong female leads. There's the term Hawkian woman. Which is sort of the archetype of a tough topic, talking, assertive, witty woman. And this comes from the director Howard Hawks, so his last name Hawkian, who had lots of female characters like this in this film, especially his screwball comedies. The film we're watching today is not a Hawks film, but that idea sort of applies to a lot of screwball comedies. And often in these films, the male protagonist's masculinity is seemingly sort of challenged and poked fun at, but not too much. So why were screwball comedies so popular during the Great Depression? Now remember, we're really talking about post summer of 1934 when the production code is enforced. So after the production code is forced, more blatant references to sex and sexuality had to be toned down. Right? You couldn't show skin. You couldn't sort of overtly say things in the same manner as you could during the pre-code era. So the use of innuendo and witty banter and double talk to imply what used to be able to be said. I also want us to think about this, the screwball comedy in terms of the theme that we've been talking about throughout this class, which is escapism versus social commentary. I mean, on the surface, a lot of these screwball comedies appear like pure escapism, with sort of the witty banter and the romantic comedy aspect. And some of them, especially if there's wealthy characters, the trappings of wealth, sort of luxurious spaces, luxurious costumes, those sorts of things. But Again, a lot of these are actually commentaries on class and class differences. So, think about sort of that tension between escapism and social commentary that you see in a lot of popular culture in the 1930s, even purportedly escapist fare. So today we're watching, as I said, the classic screwball comedy, My Man Godfrey from 1936. That really is also social commentary on class and morality and obligation during the Great Depression. It actually stars real life divorced couple Carol Lombard and William Powell. Even though they had been divorced for a few years, they were quite amicable, and Powell actually recommended Lombard for the role. So William Powell, the protagonist, actually is from Kansas City, yet another classic Hollywood Kansas City connection. And at the time, he was one of the most famous actors, one of the most famous sort of leading men of the 1930s and 1940s. Anybody watching this movie would have known exactly who he was. He's most famous for a series of movies he did in the 1930s called the Thin Man movies. So check those out if you're interested. Carol Lombard, the female protagonist, was an equally famous actress at the time. And again, people would have known her name watching this film. So, going into My Man Godfrey and as an audience member in 1936, you're sort of watching this hyped up comedy starring two of the biggest stars at the time. Carol Lombard, unfortunately, tragically died in 1942 in a plane crash, which devastated her husband at the time in 1942, Clark Gable. He probably never really romantically recovered from her death. The film, though, has some wonderful supporting and character actors in addition to the acting skills of Lombard and Powell. So you have Alice Brady, Eugene Pallett, Gail Patrick, Misha Au. I mean, there's some great, Misha Auer. There's some great sort of supporting characters here. I think that we can talk about that some. It's directed by Gregory LaCava, who is kind of a forgotten director today, but he was a very successful director in classic Hollywood and screenwriter. He started out as a screenwriter. My Man Godfrey, as I mentioned, was incredibly popular with film audiences, but also very popular with critics at the time. It was nominated for 6 Academy Awards, but won none, unfortunately. And today is still considered one of the greatest screwball comedies and even one of the greatest comedies of this era. So some things to think about when watching the film, and some things maybe if you're doing the film clip assignment to look for a clip about, or when we're discussing the film to look for. So what makes this a screwball comedy? In what way does it adhere to the conventions of the genre that you read about in your reading for the day? And does it push against screwball comedy genre conventions in any way? Also, in the assigned article, the author argues that the potentially subversive aspects of comedy films in the 1930s and screwball comedies was not found in the plot, right? Especially, we're looking in the post-code era. So subversiveness was not in the plot, but it comes in other ways, such as use of language. So how does language in the film, how is language used sort of subversively, or maybe to sort of throw in some references that could be interpreted in multiple ways to kind of get around the censors? Another main theme is economic class. So think about how wealth and poverty are portrayed in the film. Who is deserving and who is undeserving of their status, and why? And what does this film say about notions of success and failure? Remember, the Great Depression is really the main time in American culture when we're re-examining many of our cultural myths about success and failure in the capitalist system. So if you're poor, is it your fault or not? If you're rich, is it because you did the right thing, or is it luck? So this sort of compare and contrast failure and success as structural or as individual. I think also too, one of the things you see in a lot of screwball comedies is kind of making fun of the rich. The rich is ridiculous and maybe undeserving. So what makes certain wealthy people in this film actually deserving of their status in the end? Another big thing, of course, is notions of gender and sexuality that are constructed in the film. And I mean, both sort of maleness and masculinity and femaleness and femininity, as well as sort of the interaction of the sexes. So how do these conform or push against conventions at the time? And how do class and gender interact in the film? That's sort of an interesting question. So one of the major themes of My Man Godfrey is obligation and responsibility. So, how does this theme play out in the film? And how does the idea of obligation and responsibility interact with issues of class and also issues of gender? And what are some of the values that are evident in the movie? Do we see individualism? Do we see communalism? Do we see sort of certain values around work, etc.? And this kind of relates back to the question about class. And finally, why do you think this movie and the genre of screwball comedies in general appealed to audiences so greatly during the Great Depression? And we can talk about, is this style still appealing today? Do you see any similarities to movies or TV from current times? So enjoy one of my favorite movies of the screwball comedy genre, My Man Godfrey, and we will talk about it when we meet next time.